As he had promised during the campaign, President Joe Biden brought the United States back into the Paris Climate Agreement. But what does it actually mean? What should we be looking for in the future if we want to see the US be part of this international effort to deal with climate change? Well, joining us right now is an expert who's going to spell it all out for us. This is the Director of Strategy and Policy for the COP High-Level Champions for Climate Action, Jen Austin. Welcome to the Damage Report.
Thank you, John. Glad to be here.
We're very glad to have you here. So I'm assuming you were not particularly surprised by the re-entry. It had been telegraphed pretty much as anything else politically over the past year or so.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very clear commitment by the Biden campaign. And so I think we knew by day one that that was going to be a priority for day one. And they did, in fact, follow through on their first day with an executive order, including a commitment to rejoin the Paris Agreement.
Awesome. And for those who might not know all the ins and outs, especially with the US's checkered history over the past few years with the agreement, well, in sort of broad terms, what is the agreement about? What is it intended to accomplish?
Sure. So the Paris Agreement is a global agreement through which the countries of the world are getting together to try to address climate change, their biggest shared pressing challenge and concern. And it was negotiated over many years up until and came together in 2015. So the Paris Agreement was agreed that year. And importantly, they had learned from many years of negotiations on climate. And what the Paris Agreement did is it made sure that every country had a specific emissions reduction commitment. And in previous times, in previous attempts at climate agreements, either not all the countries were included, or they tried too much to negotiate exactly what those targets needed to be. And so countries ultimately couldn't sign up to it. And what the Paris Agreement did was it sort of merged both of those. It made sure that every country in the world, including some of the fast developing countries, were involved. Whereas when we started these negotiations, now 26 years ago, because we're coming up on the 26th conference, there was a very different balance in size of economies and who was responsible for emissions. And so some of the developing countries like India and China were not included in needing to have their own emissions reduction targets. By the time we got to 2015, obviously, given the size of those economies and the size of their emissions, it was important that they had commitments of some sort. Equally, though, we live in a world in which countries are sovereign nations. They make their own rules. Most laws are enforceable within country boundaries and less so across country boundaries. And so the agreement made it so that every country was committed to putting forward a commitment, and there's a process for transparency, and that those commitments would be transparent and transparently reported on. And then we'd allow the political process to play out through which countries make progress towards those commitments, can put pressure and encouragement on each other to achieve what they said they would achieve and then go further. And now, 5 years later, we're set up for what were called the first review and ratchet. And so the deal itself included a plan for targets that cover 5 years, and then every 5 years to together revisit those targets, recognizing that as big a breakthrough as it was for all the countries to agree to the Paris Agreement, when they did, the goals they put on the table didn't add up to where we needed to be. So we knew already that we would need to revisit that. And that's really what's on the table for this year.
So basically you're saying that even if during this review, it's shown that they have accomplished what they had individually said they would after 5 years, that by itself isn't necessarily an amazing sign in terms of being able to meet the overall goals over a longer period of time?
Right, it's very good progress, but it's not enough. And so the Paris Agreement included the countries of the world together saying that they wanted to limit warming to no more than 2 degrees, with best efforts to actually limit that to 1.5 degrees. That was their shared goal. Then they had to put an individual commitment on the table. Even on day one, if you added up those individual commitments, they didn't add to 2 degrees, never mind 1.5. Since then, the science has only gotten more clear. We know the urgency has only gotten more. The difference between that 1.5 and 2 degrees in terms of impacts in the world is very, very stark. And so if we were on track to achieve even those original commitments, that was a first, very important step, but only a first step. The reality is, in some cases, we're not on track to achieve those commitments. And now that next step has to be taken, both to figure out what needs to be done to make sure those goals are achieved, and importantly, what that next level of ambition needs to be to make sure we get to our shared ultimate goal of limiting warming to 1.5.
For more political news breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.